And so I think Taiwan is a hedge against that to some extent. That's my theory. So there's motivation besides just historical precedents, all that kind of stuff, for them to want to do this at some point in the relatively near future. And wow, what a way to distract America if there was an EMP attack in America.
And people at the highest levels of our government and in intel, again, are downplaying the threat of a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse because of mutually assured destruction. There are localized EMP capabilities that Iran has already given to Hezbollah. And via a drone attack, using highly charged explosives and capacitors, those kind of localized EMP threats could hit us here in our mainland right now.
The U.S. uses over 4 trillion kilowatt hours per year of electricity. That's a lot of electricity. And the demand signal is just growing rapidly, exponentially, especially where the demand signal for AI and data centers are concerned. And last week's guest, Wes Morgan, who works for one of the largest utilities in the country, told us that the demand for energy is expected to grow 180% in the next few years. So much of our grid is old. At least one component dates back to 1937. And that grid is already struggling to keep up with the demand. So for a system that's already teetering on the edge of failure, it doesn't take much to push a system like that over the edge, either by accident or on purpose from a bad actor.
It's never been at a higher threat level than I can remember, ever since I was sliding under my desk in elementary school during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Good day, everyone, and welcome back to Fire for Effect, recording this week's episode on April 2nd, 2026. This is episode 37, and it is the third and final installment of the 3-part special Lights Out, exploring the threat of an electromagnetic pulse, which the EMP Commission called an existential threat in its report published in 2017, almost a decade ago. It's a threat that Congress has been warned and aware of for more than a quarter of a century, and it's a threat to which we are still largely vulnerable. The most dangerous problems are not the ones that we don't understand. The most dangerous problems are the ones that we understand perfectly and still fail to act on. If you haven't watched the previous 2 episodes, I would encourage you to go back and do that before watching this one. Episode 1, entitled Fiction, Fact, and the Fragility of the Grid, we introduced the vulnerability of the United States electric grid through a novel called 1 Second After by William Forstchen, and the findings of the Congressional EMP Commission dating all the way back to 2004. That episode explained how an electromagnetic pulse could disable electronic infrastructure across large portions of the country, and explored how dependent modern society is on electricity, telecommunications, fuel distribution, water systems, transportation, finance, healthcare. All of these infrastructures rely on a stable electrical grid. Episode 2, entitled Inside the Grid, What Actually Breaks, we moved away from the theory to operational reality through a conversation with Wes Morgan, an experienced electrician, a lineman, and a utility manager. The discussion there explained how electricity flows through the grid, from generation plants to transmission lines to substations and local distribution systems. Listeners were introduced to the key components of the grid, such as transformers and the computerized control systems that our utilities use. That episode also highlighted structural vulnerabilities in the grid, including the long lead times that are required to replace critical components, like large power transformers, for example. We examined how cascading failures can occur, when one component fails and stresses all the surrounding systems. And we explore the practical recovery challenges following large-scale outages, including black start procedures, supply chain constraints for replacement equipment, and the logistical limits that our repair crews would face. Today, episode 3, we're exploring the policy, economic, and institutional barriers that have slowed down the action on grid protection, despite these repeated warnings that have been in place for the last 20 years or more. The U.S. electric grid is operated through a very complex structure involving private utilities, regional transmission operators, state regulators, and federal agencies. This fragmented authority complicates nationwide resilience efforts. But today we want to explore the incentive structures that affect our utilities, the political dynamics surrounding preventative infrastructure investments, and the legislative challenges of addressing low probability but very high impact threats. We also want to examine potential policy reforms and the role of Congress, federal agencies, and the private sector in strengthening grid resilience. And today, as we close out our Lights Out series, we have a guest who brings a very rare combination of experience at the highest levels of government, national security, and critical infrastructure policy. He spent years on Capitol Hill lobbying for EMP resilience and he has seen firsthand how warnings become reports and then reports die quietly in committee. Rob Hartwell is a former congressional chief of staff, having served senior leadership roles for multiple members of Congress, including the House Ways and Means Committee. He has spent decades operating at the intersection of policy, appropriations, and national-level decision-making. Since 2001, Rob has served as the president of Hartwell Capital Consulting, which is a full-service lobbying business, development, and capital access firm, and has conducted business here and abroad in the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. As president of Hartwell Capital, Rob has built and led a global network of experts that includes former National Security Council staff, senior Department of Defense officials, and leaders from our nation's top laboratories and security agencies. Over the course of his career, he's helped direct more than $23 billion in appropriations and policy initiatives across defense, energy, infrastructure, and emerging technologies. Today, he serves as the Vice President of Public Affairs for the Foundation for Infrastructure Resilience, where his work focuses directly on one of the most critical issues we've been discussing in this series, which is the vulnerability of America's electric grid and critical infrastructure to electromagnetic pulse and solar storm events. He's played a key role in educating Congress on these threats through his leadership with the National Disaster Resilience Council. In short, this is someone who not only understands the threat at a technical and policy level, but has spent years working inside the system trying to address it. Rob, welcome to Fire for Effect. We're honored to have you with us.
Thank you, Marcus. Pleased to be here, and really appreciate that. It's a too lengthy introduction, but of my background. That's okay.
We're here with Jim McBride as well. Good to see you, Jim.
Good to see you. Thanks, Rob, for joining us.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
So what we want to do with this conversation is to take everything we've built in the first 2 episodes and try to bring it into focus at the policy and the decision-making level. And as I laid out in episode 1, we talked about the threat, both the man-made EMP and the naturally occurring solar events. In episode 2, we went inside the grid and talked to Wes Morgan and saw how fragile and complex the grid actually is, and old in many cases. Many components of our electrical grid they're old. Mm-hmm. So for this final piece, we want to understand how all of that translates into action. In many cases, sadly, inaction at the national level. So from your vantage point, having worked on Capitol Hill in appropriations and now directly with infrastructure resilience, how seriously is the EMP and grid vulnerability threat actually being taken in Washington, D.C. today?
Not seriously enough, unfortunately. We've had champions over the years, starting in my experience with former Congressman Roscoe Bartlett, who was a scientist from Western Maryland and an expert on EMP. The first time I was exposed to the issue was with Congressman Bartlett. He held a briefing about EMP threats to the grid, and it demonstrated how a few operatives with 50 caliber rifles could bring down the grid of the United States. This is back in about 2000, so 20 some years ago. Subsequently, 2 EMP commissions describing the existential threat to our country, describing the fact that between 90% or 90 million Americans to 90% of our entire population would pass away within 6 months if the grid came down, and how easily the grid can come down. The basic problem that we have, I think, and while we've had champions, Senator Ron Johnson is currently an elected member of the Senate from Wisconsin, is a champion. Former Congressman Chris Stewart, who was a B-1 bomber pilot, retired just last year. He was a champion. Congressman Lamborn, who represented Spacecom in Colorado, was a champion, has retired. So we've had champions through the years. The problem, I think, is with the Congress itself, and that each of these members of the House have parochial interests in their own districts that don't involve the electric grid as a national issue. They want to pay attention to the lobbyists from the utility companies that come in, and there are hundreds of them, by the way. I think I'm one of only 1 or 2 people on Capitol Hill that are bringing this issue up daily, other than the grassroots who we're speaking to now, where we need strong support from. But members of Congress are motivated by their constituents, and they're motivated by the companies in their districts, or by the labor unions in their districts. And this is not a partisan issue. It's a critical issue that must be addressed. But there's no one entity in a member of Congress's district that's asking for this to be addressed. So it's not getting the attention that it deserves. I had a meeting with Sheriff John Rutherford, who was currently a champion on this issue, from Florida. He's from Nassau County. And I walked into his office, and much to my amazement, he asked me right away, "Have you read the book 1 Second After?" which is the book that you were focusing in on in your first episode. And I said, "Yes, sir, Congressman. That's why I'm here." And we proceeded to he's on the Appropriations Committee. He's a senior member. And I was in his office last week again, trying to make sure that we have some money directed towards this. And we'll discuss that later, I'm sure, some of the solutions that we have out there. And I asked him, "Well, is anybody bringing this issue up in the Republican conference?" And he said, "Yeah, I brought it up the other day." And most of the members were on their cell phones and texting. And I think only one other member of the entire Republican caucus said anything about it. That was Congressman Morgan Luttrell from Texas, whose brother's quite famous, by the way.
Marcus Luttrell.
Marcus Luttrell. And I'm going in to see him next week. But I feel like I've spent 4 years and 300 plus meetings on Capitol Hill now, representing the Foundation for Infrastructure Resilience, representing the most brilliant scientists and authors of the EMP Commission reports, author of President Trump's Executive Order 13865 from 2019, Dr. George Baker, author of the military spec that requires all military bases, 188-125-1, that requires his military bases critical electrical circuits to be protected against EMP. They're not. That mil-spec came out in 2005, still not being implemented. So we have a huge problem of a hodgepodge of a national grid that is not built for survivability like the Russians and Chinese grids are. If you ask AI about are the Chinese and Russian grids hardened against EMP, you'll get a lot of information that yes, they are. They're built to survive an EMP attack, and they're also built so they're not all interconnected. If one section goes down, it's not going to bring the rest of the grid down like our country. So we have that issue. We have an issue of members of Congress, chairmen of key committees that need to be addressing this issue, that are being told by our national security agencies, well, it's not really much of a threat. If somebody launches an EMP a high altitude electromagnetic pulse at us, we'll know who it is and we'll nuke them. The mutually assured destruction scenario still plays in the minds of our top intel chiefs, and they don't realize that there's other EMP threats, localized EMP, or just even cybersecurity attacks, which we've had in our grid. Men with rifles from cells that are in the United States that we don't know where they are or who they are. It's not just an EMP. There's multiple threats to the grid, and the leadership that we need has to come from this administration and from the top. President Trump took that step in 2019, bipartisan effort, and the Biden administration did not nix that executive order. They just sat on it and fired most of the people that were experts on the subject because they had other priorities in terms of DHS and immigration and such. So we've had leadership. We need to ask this administration and this Congress to step up to the plate now. We've never been at a higher threat level than I can remember. Ever since I was, sliding under my desk in elementary school during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But we've never had a higher threat level than we have now, and not just from nation states, but from terrorists as well.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of really good points there. The one that caught my attention the most is you mentioned, the couple of people with 50 caliber rifles. It doesn't even take a 50 cal rifle to do the damage that you're talking about. It reminded me of in the EMP Commission's report, one of the in the section titled "Physical Attacks on the Power Grids." Mm-hmm. They referenced an April 16, 2013 event where a handful of unknown parties used AK-47s to attack the Metcalf transformer substations that service San Jose and the Silicon Valley.
What is the most terrifying attack you can possibly imagine? For some, it's the prospect of a nuclear bomb. For others, chemical or biological agents. But among the list of potential outcomes, one option stands by far above the rest. That option is an attack on our power grid, disabling the use of electricity and leading to large-scale, persistent blackouts across a large, populated area. The United States government is aware, in 2006, that transformers are a critical infrastructure vulnerability, and yet, 16 years later now, in 2021, they are still discussing the vulnerability of these particular grid components, citing them as a critical infrastructure vulnerability. It matters because of the Metcalf transmission substation on April 16th of 2013. Owned by the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, PG&E, Metcalf Substation is a transformer bank that supplies power to a large part of Silicon Valley and the surrounding area of California. On April 16th, 2013, early in the morning, there was an attack. For clarity and organization, I will break this down into a minute-by-minute timeline of the events because this truly is the most terrifying attack you never heard of. 12:58 a.m. Inside an underground vault next to Route 101 near San Jose, AT&T fiber optic cables are severed. 1:07 a.m. Additional cables are severed in a local internet service provider's vault near the substation, causing residents of the surrounding area to lose internet access. 1:31 a.m. The only known footage of the attack is gathered by a CCTV camera pointed along a chain link fence on the outskirts of the substation. All that is seen is a flash of light, suspected to be a flashlight signal, and sparks. These sparks are later determined to be from bullets colliding with the fence itself as they pass through it. 6 minutes later, at 1:37 a.m., Pacific Gas and Electric receives a motion sensor warning from the area of fence directly adjacent to the camera and the sparks, believed to be from the sparks themselves. 1:41 a.m. A 911 call is placed by a nearby engineer at a power plant that still had outgoing call capabilities, claiming that he heard massive gunfire. The fiber optic cables that had been severed a few minutes earlier prevented nearly all surrounding areas from making outgoing calls. This engineer was in one of the very few unaffected locations, thus being able to call the police. 1:45 a.m. A full bank of transformers, having overheated after leaking 52,000 gallons of oil out into the substation, triggers an equipment failure alarm at the Pacific Gas and Electric Control Center. 5 minutes later, at 1:50 a.m. precisely, there is another flash of light, believed to be yet another flashlight signal. 1 minute after that, exactly 1:51 a.m., police arrive. There is no sign of suspicious activity, there are no suspects, just a calm, quiet, seemingly normal night. Officers leave shortly after they arrive. Over an hour later, at 3:15 in the morning, a Pacific Gas and Electric worker arrives to survey the situation and investigate why the alarms were actually triggered. He is met with an unknown number of bullet holes, over $15 million worth of damage, stacked rock piles, and over 100 shell casings outside the fence. In a comprehensive investigation, it was found that the stacked rocks were very likely used as a method of scouting the firing position. This is a tactic historically employed by certain very elite military squads, and it also discovered that every single one of the bullet casings had been fully wiped clean of any fingerprints. It was suspected that there had been between 2 and 6 gunmen positioned outside the fence firing well over 100 rounds into the station and specifically aiming for major vulnerable internal transformer components. The attackers were never once caught on camera. 1 minute before the police arrived, they ceased firing, signaled each other, and left. So quickly and so quietly that the officers had no idea anything was even wrong. Before the attack, they had severed specific fiber optic cables that disabled surrounding phones, as well as the bulk of internal substation sensors as well. During the attack, they heavily damaged or outright disabled 17 of the large-scale critical transformers in the substation, and they caused $15 million worth of damage, with frantic efforts by local utility companies to then reroute power through other Silicon Valley stations, and all of this in under 20 minutes. Transformers like those at the Metcalfe substation weigh up to 500,000 pounds. At the time of the attack, there were only 7 companies in all of the United States capable of manufacturing them, and the largest of those companies could only produce 10 units per month. An unknown number of gunmen, in less than 20 minutes, had disabled almost a full month's worth of transformers from 2 out of 7 domestic companies working exclusively on just repairing that damage. There are only roughly 2,000 of these transformers in operation in total. They are the most critical component of our entire electrical grid, and yet these attackers had scouted, attacked, disabled, or destroyed 17 of them in minutes, disappearing into the night. To this day, there is no indication of who carried out the attack or why. Former federal energy regulator John Wellinghoff, according to AP News, described the attack as, quote, the most sophisticated and extensive attack that's ever occurred on the grid. And security experts later speculated that even if a few additional attacks were carried out simultaneously, the results could take entire sections of the West Coast power grid offline for days, even weeks. Perpetrated at scale, the attack format and sophistication could have knocked out the power to most of the country for a period of weeks, even months. And to this day, we have no idea who did this, why they did this, or if they might ever try again. The following year, a report by the Congressional Research Service on the physical security of the United States power grid references the Metcalfe substation attack 22 different times. And although only a very small number of residents lost power directly because of this attack, the security implications of how cleanly and effectively they have targeted and destroyed 17 of the most critical items in the entire grid structure were terrifying. Physical ballistic operations carried out by just a few men with some rifles are clearly capable of doing incredible damage to our infrastructure.
This is something that we've already seen play out in real time. So it's not even a hypothetical. We've seen somebody try this in the past.
Yeah, just 2 years ago, Moore, North Carolina, Fort Bragg. That county, 2 counties, I believe, were down for 10 days without power because the substation was attacked. We never found out who did it. And the number of attacks has increased in the 1,000% range on substations just in the last 5 years. I don't have the exact number right now. I know it was 1,000 or 2,000% increase in the number of attacks on substations. Fortunately, not all are successful, but we've had too many that are. Oregon, Washington State, California, New York, Baltimore, Maryland, we narrowly avoided and caught the people that were going to attack the substation there, and more North Carolina that I just mentioned.
So that's interesting. I had no idea that the number of attacks was that high. Is there any indication that they're coordinated in any way? Because as we talked about last episode, I was blown away by the fact that the commission identified the fact that there are 9 key transformers in our grid system, that if just those 9, you were talking about choke points, how it's all interconnected, and if one thing goes down, multiple things go down. They didn't tell, obviously they didn't give the locations, but apparently there are 9 substations, critical substations in our grid, that if all 9 of those went down at the same time, the entire country would be blacked out. And so these bad actors, the reason I ask if they're interconnected, I'm curious if they're kind of just playing the averages.
I haven't talked to Kash Patel about this recently, so I couldn't tell you. The FBI is supposed to be tracking these folks, and the FBI is not talking about where the cells are, who are in the cells. It's something that in the halls of Congress, in the cloakrooms, and behind closed doors in skiffs, I hope they're discussing, and I hope they're tracking these folks down. I haven't seen anything about multiple arrests. And I know, in the Biden administration, they were basically claiming that the attacks were going to come from white nationalists. In this administration, it's probably terror cells that we don't know who all these actors were that we let across the border. So frankly, I don't know. And I'm focusing on the existential threat of an entire grid down situation that is the most catastrophic thing that can happen. And people at the highest levels of our government and in intel, again, are downplaying the threat of a high altitude electromagnetic pulse because of mutually assured destruction. That is not necessarily the case. And there are localized EMP capabilities that Iran has already given to Hezbollah. The Jerusalem Post has documented that last October. And via a drone attack using highly charged explosives and capacitors, those kind of localized EMP threats could hit us here in our mainland right now. Marcus, there was to talk about the serious threat to our infrastructure, there's a chart that I sent to you. Could you bring that up for a minute? I just want to walk through some of those infrastructures. So within a matter of seconds, there's 16 critical infrastructures that have been identified by the Department of Homeland Security. And this chart kind of just details which of them fail within seconds, which of them fail within minutes to hours, and which of them fail within days. And Colonel Steve Chill, who is a Marine Corps colonel, part of our infrastructure foundation, wrote a paper on what happens to these critical infrastructures when the grid goes down for 30 days. And that paper's been widely distributed. It's on the Foundation for Infrastructure Resilience website as well, fur.foundation.org. The chemical industry, which provides all of the chemicals for our water plants, by the way, to purify the water, fails within seconds. So those are water plants that don't have chemicals on site that will last for weeks. They have them on site that'll last for days in some cases, but they'll come down right after that because there's no chemicals. Commercial facilities, manufacturing facilities, communications come down within minutes to hours. No GPS in the event of an EMP. Our satellites in the upper atmosphere, if it's a high altitude EMP, the satellites will deteriorate and burn up in the atmosphere because of the expanding atmosphere from an EMP attack. It happened, we EMP'd ourselves in 1962 with a exercise called Starfish Prime, which was a high altitude electromagnetic pulse burst 900 miles away from Hawaii. And it took out some of our satellites, and took out portions of the grid and the electric power supply in Hawaii. And that's when our U.S. military kind of first realized, wait a second, what did we just do? We have a problem here. And really went into some detailed studies on it. And the Russians were watching that too, by the way. On this chart then, the only infrastructure that lasts for some period of time are our dams and the electric power from our hydroelectric power situations. Yet there's a rule that I understand that the dams have to quit providing electricity to the grid if the national grid comes down, because the grid won't be able to handle that electricity, so the dams have to shut down too. Well, we need to make sure those dams are providing resilient power above and beyond what our grid is providing, especially for critical military operations, critical military bases. And that's something else I want to discuss too. Our energy is a black line through this. Financial services, no ATMs, no banking, no exchanges, no computerized credit cards exist in seconds. Government facilities fail to be able to operate. Food and agriculture lasts a little bit longer. Healthcare lasts for a few days. I just gave a speech in Cleveland to the MAHA conference out there on grid resilience and its impact on healthcare. Critical care patients start dying almost immediately when the emergency backup provided power that is about 72 hours goes out. When the grid went down in Texas, in Houston, Texas, and Dallas during the ice storm a couple of years ago. They had to transport people out of hospitals to save their lives to other areas of the state, as far away as Louisiana and Arizona.
For another example, we can look at the United States and a power grid failure in Texas. February 15th, 2021, temperatures in the state of Texas dipped below 10 degrees. Swept up in an Arctic cold front, the state's power grid would become strained and eventually collapse completely, as the temperatures dropped to near historic lows. Texas was not equipped for this meteorological nightmare, and over the span of 3 days, as many as 700 people lost their lives, with nearly $200 billion worth of additional damage. Over the years, events like these have proven just how vulnerable we are to a grid failure. And yet, despite this overwhelming evidence and the fragility of America's power delivery systems, very little is being done to fix it.
IT crashes, nuclear power. Power plants will melt down, in some cases, not all of them, but where your control rods are exposed, your waste pools that are surrounded by water, where the water evaporates after you lose your backup power. And those generators, in many cases, are not protected against EMP. You start having meltdowns in nuclear power plants within 30 days of the grid coming down. And one of the most critical infrastructures is water. Water is the key to life. Our water supplies start dying out in a matter of a couple days. We don't have potable water. People come out of the cities, as was demonstrated written about in the book 1 Second After, mass migration from urban areas down the highways, down the railroad tracks, people foraging for food. Most people have food for a week or so on hand, but when that runs out, they're going to be looking at grocery stores and the pharmacies and anywhere where there's food coming out of the cities, foraging, and they're looking for potable water as well. So it's a really horrible situation if we lose the grid and our critical infrastructures. And there's one infrastructure that's not on this list that probably should be. I'll talk to Colonel Chill about that because we're working hard on it, is our U.S. military. Our military bases that do have requirements for continuous operations, for mission assurance, that they're able to conduct and operate the missions that they are designed to operate under Department of War. If they don't have outside power and outside water coming into that base, they can't operate and they can't complete their missions. And our first focus, and our focus this year legislatively, is working very hard with the HASC and the SAFs, the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committees, and the appropriators to get them to start addressing the need to harden our military infrastructure. Without a military, a National Guard, if we were in a grid down situation, we'd have a horrible situation with gangs, people roving out of the cities, looting. Basically, our emergency responders, police, and fire departments would not be able to curtail and keep law and order. We would need our U.S. military to do that. So that's another topic that I'd like to discuss.
Yeah, and Rob, the things that you were just laying out corroborate and reinforce and add on to a lot of the examples we brought up in episode 1, which Marcus and I just found from just basic research, open source research online. Some real world examples of massive power outages. You mentioned one, an ice storm. There was the one last year in Spain and Portugal, and the impacts that had on society, like within hours. Even though in those situations they have the ability to have backup generators, and with an EMP, as we know now, hopefully if you watch the first 2 episodes, you know now there's probably not going to be backup generator power unless you have some kind of rare backup generator that has a Faraday cage around it or whatever that's protected, but that's going to be extremely rare. So, but even with the backup power and generators, it still had a massive impact on society, on like you said, the critical care patients, water supply, transportation, across the board. And I think it's better to kind of address as to why there's been so much foot dragging on addressing this issue in Congress. And I think it's just psychology, human psychology, the fact that there's so many huge things that are so challenging and so kind of frightening that when it becomes almost too big of a problem or perceived as too big of a problem, Congress just gets bogged down and wants to just ignore it. I mentioned that the national debt, for example, as being a ticking time bomb.
Yeah.
A frog in a slow boiling kettle is going to have a massive impact. Marcus and I being Marines, and I studied at National Defense University. The threat of China and their naval capacity and their ability to produce ships, I think it surpassed the United States back in like 2018, and they've only accelerated. And it's now open source. In the news, I saw 60 Minutes did a story just I think this past week on the horrible condition of our shipbuilding capacity in the United States. And we just kind of let these things go, and we've been complacent about it. The national grid, as Wes pointed out very, very well on episode 2, I think one of the key components that he mentioned was as old as 1937, if I'm not mistaken. In the 1930s, there's still components out there that we're using that are still somehow functioning, which blows my mind. And so to upgrade the grid and protect these key components, of course, is extremely expensive. And combined with our national debt and all these other priorities, sometimes I think just Congress as a whole, just their brain shuts down, like, oh, we can't address that now, it's too difficult. And especially when we're so divided, politically, and Congress being such a narrow majority on the Republican side. And when Democrats, when they have control of Congress, it's going to be narrow on their side too, probably. So these are just some issues that, which you deal with every day. Like you said, you speak on this every single day, and you're trying to persuade Congress to kind of open their eyes. And it sounds like you said, Congressman Luttrell, being a former Navy SEAL, like his brother, gets this from a national security perspective. And I'm guessing most of the Congress members that are aware of this and are paying attention, you could tell me, I'm assuming a lot of them are former military, like Mr. Luttrell. But just wanted to just get your opinion on that, on why it seems that Congress is slow to open its eyes on this and take it seriously.
So in defense of DOW and some of our policymakers, we've studied this issue, 2 EMP commission reports, a presidential executive order. President's executive order in 2019 was then codified in the NDAA in 2021, the National Defense Authorization Act. The Department of Homeland Security codified its portions of the presidential executive order in the appropriations bill in 2024. Basically, those bills said, well, let's study how to protect our grid against EMP. Let's study what we need to do. How much is it going to cost? Address a lot of the issues about how to do this. Meanwhile, industry has come up with solutions. You mentioned Faraday cage. Well, they've been around for years, but they're very, very expensive, and they're very large build kinds of things. There are now surge protection devices for the distribution grid. And the big generation transmission grid generally will survive an EMP. Some of the transformers will blow out. We probably don't have enough in reserve, but they're designed to take 150,000 volts through the power lines and to transmit that down to the step down stations in the distribution grid. The distribution grid is something where we have to protect the ability to continue sending that power out to consumers, to business, to our military bases. So 3 years ago in the NDAA, I was able to obtain language that both the chairman, then it was Jack Reed, the Democrat, and Roger Wicker was the ranking member at that time. It's switched since then. But I was able to get language in the NDAA that they trumpeted in their report saying, And for the first time ever, the Department of War is going to protect its electronic circuits against electromagnetic weapons. It was pulled out, yanked out by the Pentagon 10 days later. And in fairness to the Pentagon said, we don't know how to do it, don't know how to protect it. We don't know how much it's going to cost. We don't know what program line in the budget to put the money into. Basically, they were saying, even though they've been mandated to study all this stuff, and I had report language in the House side that year, basically telling them that prioritize your military bases, prioritize new technologies that are out there, tell us what can protect you, how much it's going to cost, and where we need to put the money. That required a report in March 2 years ago. The report never showed up in the halls of Congress. The bureaucracy at the Pentagon has been terrible. The experts on intelligence that figure that we're not going to get hit by high altitude electromagnetic pulse, but aren't looking at the fact that the grid can be taken apart in other ways, are telling our legislators that it's not the highest priority. You mentioned China and their shipbuilding and their missile production. And the CEO of Palantir came out this morning and said we only have an 8-day supply of munitions and weapons if we go to war with China. Our industrial base is in huge need. There are bigger issues. And so if I'm in the Pentagon or I'm looking at an immediate threat other than EMP from our adversaries, I'm going to say we need to build more ships. We need to build space weapons. We need to build, satellite and space defense. Those are the priorities. Those are the big systems. I was meeting with the House Armed Services Committee staff recently, and I said we need $10.4 billion to protect all of our military bases. I gave them a number. We came up with an estimate. The physicists on our team sat down with the economists and they came up with a number. And it was based off Quantico, by the way, because we had all the numbers. We'd done an assessment for Quantico. We had all the numbers of all their power needs and everything at Quantico that they needed to protect. And then we extrapolated that out nationwide. It's probably, good within 5% or so. $10.4 billion, phase it in over 5 years, prioritize the bases that you need to protect and start doing it right now. And you don't have to tell us what you're doing, where you're doing it. Obviously, our nuclear Minuteman missiles are protected, and our B-52s are protected. Many, many years ago, we did that using wireless and harness cages and Faraday cages, really for the shielding of all those electrical circuits. And our latest weapon systems, by and large, are protected mostly, but not our logistics, not our fuel tankers, not our fuel trucks, not our fuel farms. So we know how much it's going to cost. We know what surge protection is available now that's much cheaper than what was anticipated. You can protect a transformer for less than 1% of the cost of a transformer now with 3 or 4, depending upon how the electrical configuration is on that transformer, with surge protection. There are commercial low-end surge protection. I'm not going to show the company name here, but this is a surge protection device for an electric meter in your home that you have. And millions of these are selling across the United States, made by a company out of Kansas. There's a company in Connecticut that makes surge protection for the distribution grid. So the technologies are out there. What that language that was pulled out of the NDA 3 years ago, and I understand the justification of why it was pulled out. DOD, DOW didn't know how to do it, what to do, and didn't know about the technologies that exist now. So we are in our meetings with the Congress, in the Pentagon. I was in the Pentagon 2 weeks ago. I'll be in the Department of Energy again. We're going up there and we're telling them how to do it and what exists and how relatively inexpensive it is. Talking about a huge increase in the defense budget this year. The president, I believe, is going to propose to bring our defense budget to 5% of GDP, which he has asked all of our NATO allies to do, and a few of them are following suit. Germany, in particular, is stepping up to the plate now after some years of neglect. They're on the front line with Russia, and Russia doesn't seem like it's going to stop in Ukraine if they get the opportunity. So our defense budget is proposed to go up by $450 billion to reach that 5% of GDP. None of the staff at the Haskell staff seem to believe that's credible or real or it's going to happen. But we've got ships to build. We have missile defense systems to build. And a topic like EMP that falls under operations and maintenance of simply switching out new surge protection devices, putting them in parallelity or lightning devices on your military bases is not the sexiest line item to plus up. I mean, frankly, that's what I was told by the staff. It's not a sexy thing like all those weapon systems. We're probably not going to be able to get that $1.5 billion you won in the first year. I have to say that we've been in to see Vice Chairman Rob Whitman from Virginia on the HASC, and he understands the threat, and he understands that it's not necessarily a high altitude electromagnetic pulse. And he understands that our military bases are under direction now to put microgrids on all the military bases so they have power, electric power sustainability. And until we met with Vice Chairman Whitman a couple months ago, they didn't have a requirement that they be hardened against EMP. So they're going to upgrade all of our military bases and electrical systems and put microgrids, probably powered by small modular reactors at some point when we finally get them flowing and get them approved. But there was no plan to protect those microgrids against EMP, which we insisted needed to be done. And I think we have an agreement that they're going to do that now, which is a critical step. That's by 2035. They're supposed to be ready to go to war against us in 2027. Article again this morning, 6,000 hypersonic missiles that China has pointed it into PACCOM. How many of them have electromagnetic warhead potentials in them? They all have nuclear capabilities. They come in at speeds that we've not ever dealt with before. And I know that we're working hard on Guam and some of our other military bases to harden them. I don't know what they're doing in terms of hardening against EMP, although I know they did put out a request for proposals a year and a half ago. It may be too late. I don't know. But we now know how we can do it. We know we can do it affordably. We're filling in the Congress on that every day. And really what we need is support from the grassroots. Just the folks in your podcast, retired military officers, people that are knowledgeable about this, we need them to contact their members of Congress. We need them to contact any of the officials in the Trump administration that they may know. And it's not a partisan issue. Democrats and Republicans alike that I've met with have all said, we need to do something. What do we do? How do we do it? We tell them what needs to be done. And then they say, well, we don't know if we can afford it. I don't think they can. I think the Congress
can't afford not to
afford it. They can't afford not to. This is exactly right. So, all of these things are compounding the hodgepodge of the grid, the parochial interests of members of Congress. There's not a grassroots uprising demanding that action be taken on this threat. And we need people to start paying attention and to communicate the need that this has to be done.
One quick follow-up question, really quick. This made me think of something. The grassroots effort, and you lobby Congress, but there's nothing to prevent states from spending money to protect infrastructure within the states as well. So we can also and should also lobby our state Congress or state, representatives and senators as well.
Yeah, and Texas is leading the nation on protecting the grid. CenterPoint Energy in Texas is hardening its facilities. There are only 4 or 5 of the electric utility companies in the United States. Fortunately, Dominion is one of them. Duke Power is one. CenterPoint is one. I should know the others off the top of my head, but I don't. But have hardened their control rooms against electromagnetic pulse, not their transmission, not their distribution grid. I briefed Attorney General Maieres and Terry Cole, who was the Secretary of Public Safety in Virginia 3 years ago, with former TAG for Virginia, General Bob Newman, David Winks, our physicist on our FIR team. And Attorney General Maieres turned towards General Newman, who was the Virginia TAG General. And he said, General Newman, Dominion Power tells me they've got this under control. Is that truthful? And General Newman said, no, they might have it under control to protect their main transmission, capabilities. But if the public isn't protected, and if their distribution system isn't protected, if they manage to repair the main transmission facilities and are able to generate that power, they can't send that power out unless they have 40% of their customer base ready to receive it. 40% is kind of the threshold where they're able to generate the power and restart the grid from a black sky incident. They can't do it. And the utility industry, and I'll give credit to a few of them. They're starting along. There's a EIS Council, Electrical Industry Council, that is trying to move forward, and some of the very leaders in the industry are part of that council. Dominion is part of it, then Duke and PJM, Centerpoint. Some states, Colorado has moved to protect some of its infrastructure against EMP. Maine is currently considering legislation to do so. So yeah, it's happening at the states, but what the Foundation for Infrastructure Resilience is calling for is a new executive order from the president, appointing a grid czar, appointing someone to take control of this critical situation, make sure the national grid is protected, is modernized, is hardened against EMP. And we're going up and briefing DOE and the Vice President's office on this. Vice President Vance has mentioned EMP before on Tucker Carlson's show. He understands it. Pete Hegseth understands this issue. But we haven't been told anything real is being done about it. And I think we would know. We have some pretty highly cleared people that are part of our foundation, and they're still pressing and saying, no, it's not happening. It needs to happen now. But you're right. States are a good laboratory for starting the process and for calling attention to it. We need to expand that effort. And you're in South Carolina. You have some pretty serious nuclear facilities down there. You have knowledgeable people down there. It's a good place to start. North Carolina as well. I'll give you one example. In Virginia, in the last legislative session, we had a effort to finally start moving the ball forward in Virginia on EMP, led by a couple state senators and then the governor's office. And we had an amendment come up in the state Senate that was quashed by, I think, your senator, Marcus, represents Montclair, Jeremy McPike. Jeremy McPike heads up a commission in Virginia on grid resilience and grid modernization. And he said, well, this is redundant. We already have a commission to address this. And, everything that Governor Youngkin was trying to propose was kind of being quashed by the legislature then. A lot of partisanship, even if stuff made sense. And so Senator McPike made a motion to, I was waiting to testify online with several other members of FER, and we were never called to testify. He brought up a motion to dismiss it and table the resolution. And he said, we already have a commission that's redundant. That commission hadn't met in 2.5 years. So he basically said, we're already addressing this issue, but we're not, and tabled the measure.
On paper.
Yeah. So that's an example of a negative thing that can happen in the states. Enough people have to come together and realize this is an existential threat to our country. It's not being handled. The national debt is one of those two. Who's championing cutting spending and balancing the budget again? That's not happening either. Who's championing our industrial base? I think President Trump's doing a pretty good job on that. The administration has focused some energies on our industrial base, finally, but we're nowhere near ready to handle the threats that we have. And EMP is something that we've studied and have been bouncing around for 20 years or more. And it's one of those things that they're still not ready to really start spending money on. Although we have some support from appropriators now, and I think we're going to see some change in the National Defense Authorization Act this year. I'm praying for that. I think we all need to pray for that.
Yeah, we've been admiring this problem for half a century. We were well past the point where we should have done more than we have. Mm-hmm. And as you both said, it really has to be an end-to-end solution. Protecting the power generation plant, while that's good, if there's nothing for it to power, because nothing else has been protected, what have we truly accomplished? And as you mentioned, and Jim and I both saw this in the Pentagon with the budgeting process, operation and maintenance, like, it's not nearly as sexy as procurement.
Right.
Everybody wants to be involved in the procurement of the latest and greatest weapon system. But if that doesn't also come with sustainment and maintenance funding, then you're setting yourself up for failure from the beginning. And that's kind of what we've done with our grid. And we're burning it at both ends, because on one hand, we're not haven't invested in decades in protecting the grid, while at the same time, we're adding exponential demand on the grid. And one of the statistics cited by Advanced Fusion Systems that you shared with me, portions of which we'll talk about in greater detail in a little bit, but a statistic cited by Advanced Fusion Systems stated that the U.S. uses over 4 trillion kilowatt hours per year of electricity, 7.76 million kilowatt hours per minute, and supplies 165.2 million customers. That's a lot of electricity. And the demand signal is just growing rapidly, exponentially, especially where the demand signal for AI and data centers are concerned. That's something we as Virginians, Rob and I, are intimately familiar with. And last week's guest, Wes Morgan, who works for one of the largest utilities in the country, told us that the demand for energy is expected to grow 180% in the next few years. So much of our grid is old. As Jim mentioned earlier, at least one component that Wes told us about dates back to 1937. And that grid is already struggling to keep up with the demand. So for a system that's already teetering on the edge of failure, which is often evidenced by planned and necessary blackouts in places like California, it doesn't take much to push a system like that over the edge. It doesn't require much help, either by accident or on purpose from a bad actor. So are either of you guys familiar with John Lovell? He's a fellow Virginian here, former U.S. Army Ranger. He and Nick Freitas kind of go back and forth a lot online. It's pretty funny. But he had multiple combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. After his military service, he worked as a Christian missionary before founding the Warrior Poets Society. It's a great thing. Check it out. And he now trains and equips individuals in personal protection, preparedness, and purposeful living. And he has a podcast, The John Lovell Show, which reaches millions of people. In a recent episode, I think it was episode 18. Maybe it's not recent, but I saw it recently. Episode 18, he had this to say about the vulnerability of our grid and the impending energy crisis. You guys check this out, and then I'll get your reactions.
Blackouts, brownouts, and the total loss of power in the future, it's a really, really big concern. A lot of times, us as Americans, we have so much going on, so many things in the news, we don't really think of a crisis until it's right here and now. And here's a crisis that we're careening toward literally right now, and that is a humongous energy crisis. The Department of Energy warned that blackouts could increase by as much as 100 times by the year 2030 if the U.S. continues on our current energy consumption trajectory. And it looks like we are, except there's one horrible fatal flaw that makes things much, much worse. And that's the advent of AI has a just meteoric rise in energy consumption. If our grid wasn't already vulnerable from hacking, just general obsolescence and breakdown, then you add the massive consumptive power of AI, and everything's going toward AI. You're using it for just general searches. Businesses are using AI. And then these huge data centers are popping up everywhere. It is incredibly energy intensive. We've got to power it somehow. But we're piling just weight after weight on this old rickety table with just peg legs that are just kind of broken off and stitched up. And that's our power grid. This is frankly unsustainable. So that's us nationally, but states are starting to issue out warnings to their citizenry as well. A friend of ours, Homesteaders of America, they put out some Virginia news earlier this year. In January, Virginia was warning about a few different blackouts, maybe as many as 7 different blackouts that were going to occur, or more that the Virginia population was going to have to encounter. Now, some of these could be good in the sense of, okay, things are going down because they're repairing, they're updating systems. California has likewise been warning citizens, and this is not a new thing because it's California. Of course, it's California. Of blackouts, brownouts, and whether it's because they just frankly don't have enough power, or they're updating, or they're trying to prevent fires from spreading about, and so they have planned or unplanned blackouts. So right now, some of you are leaning in and thinking, yeah, thanks, John. Great. As if I didn't have enough crises and things to worry about. What in the world do we do about that? If I can't do anything, well, what's the point? Well, take it in stride. I got enough going on. Well, I'd call your attention to this fact. America doesn't know how to live without energy. And if all of a sudden the lights just start going out, that has a real felt impact of like, we can't do business. We can't do basic commerce. We can't get from point A to B. Furthermore, there's the reality of if people can't heat and cool their homes, they die, particularly with the elderly. You think about hospitals and you can run on backup generators for only so long. What do you do when energy fails? What do y'all think about the potential energy crisis? Overblown or understated?
Yeah, let me address it real quick. He's right on, spot on. And the data center issue is particularly important because of the amount of power that they're now taking to complete AI calculations, to store and transmit the data that's going on. By and large, our Defense Department data centers are still not protected. There's an effort to do that I'm aware of that I really probably can't discuss. But I'll give you an example of the impact of data centers. There were 3 data centers in Virginia that suffered a failure in their systems, and they had to shut down one after the other. It took 1.3 gigs off for the first data center. The second data center was taking another gigawatt of power out. And there's this, the whole grid has to be harmonized so that they keep within a certain level of hertz. And I got an A in electronics in high school, but it's been a long time. They have to keep the grid harmonized within a certain percentage. And this is what happened in Portugal and Spain because renewables were not a baseline power, and renewables, caused a fluctuation in their grid, and the whole grid came down because of the renewables issue. It's going to happen sometime here in Northern Virginia and in the PJM grid because of the just the number of data centers. And when they come offline all at once because of a spike in power, or there's a localized grid out situation, that'll bring the whole grid down. And they came within minutes of bringing the whole grid in Northern Virginia down for quite a few hours. It wasn't going to be days. It was going to be quite a few hours. Because of the lack of harmonization and the amount of power that was being pulled out at one time. There's protection for data centers from spikes and from dirty power that's available. You mentioned Advanced Fusion. They're a company that can do that. They are building in now EMP protection. Amazon, I think, has taken the lead on that, on data centers, and on trying to fix problems with dirty power and backup power. They were by and large using diesel generated power. They're now flex fuel systems with natural gas that'll burn any kind of liquid fuel to provide backup power. So there are answers out there, but there's no mandate. Government's not requiring that they be hardened. Government's not requiring that they avoid diesel backup power generation. The environmentalists are demanding that, but still. So the whole issue of data centers, of electric vehicles, of AI, of the power demands on the grid are just making the hodgepodge of the national grid that is very fragile already that much more fragile. I was at a dinner a year and a half ago with the Thomas Jefferson Institute for Public Policy, which I was at the time the longest serving board member on. And the chairman of FERC spoke at our dinner. And I asked him, he's from Virginia, Chairman Christie. And I asked him, this is like the last question, and nobody had asked the obvious question through this whole dinner when he was doing Q&A afterwards. And I said, Mr. Chairman, how long is it before we start having rolling brownouts or blackouts in PJM and in Virginia? And at the time he said, well, it's going to happen this summer. It just came out and said it's going to happen this summer. We had some brownouts. We had rolling brownouts. We didn't have blackouts. We didn't lose power at any one time, but you could see the lights flickering when the power was reduced. Um, it's the key issue here is that in order for government to move, oftentimes you have to have a forcing event. You know, look at our airline security before 9/11, and then look after 9/11, how we reacted. And with the pandemic, how we overreacted and made some decisions that weren't good decisions and unconstitutional, I think, as we talked about earlier. What's going to happen? Are we going to have a solar storm that's going to knock down the grid for a period of time and kill millions? Hopefully not 90 million if the grid came down for 6 months or more. But are we going to have that take place before Congress and the government finally decide that this is an issue they have to address? There's 100% chance that a solar storm of the magnitude of the 1859 Carrington event solar storm will hit.
What most people don't know is that there was a major solar storm that hit the Earth in 1859. It goes by the name of the Carrington event, named for the astronomer who realized that the weird effects that happened on Earth were correlated to something he had seen on the sun. He had seen the flare and then deduced that this was related to it. Now, in 1859, the world was not a very electrical place. In fact, the primary use of electricity was telegraphs. And at the time, this burst of plasma caused those telegraphs stations caught fire, the entire network went down, telegraph operators were shocked at their stations, messages could be sent even though there was no power being delivered to the system. It went down and the induced charge in the wires was enough for telegraph operators to send messages over distances. So it was very dramatic if you were involved in telegraphs, but for the rest of humanity, it was a minor event. Now, we live in a very different world. We live in a world where everything has an electrical component. The way our cars function, the way food shows up in the supermarket, the way air travel and air traffic control works, all of these things are heavily electrical, and they are all tremendously vulnerable to the EMP effects that will come with a major solar impact.
It happens every 200 years. We've gone back and carbon dated glaciers and trees through history. And there's also Miyake storms, I think it's Miyake, that are even much more devastating, that happen every 10,000 years or so. But we know that the national grid, or a major portion of the national grid, is going to come down from solar weather at some point. It's a certainty. And yet we're still not protecting the grid. And there's methods to do that against solar weather too. Very similar. There's E1, E2, and E3. I won't go into explaining the differences, but electromagnetic pulse, E1, and then E3 is geomagnetic forces caused by solar weather or coronal mass ejections that send currents into the power lines and into all of our electrical components and into the ground. And the ground resonates with these currents, geomagnetic currents that come up and can fry out our electrical equipment. I'm just at a loss as to why the utility industry, why government can't recognize the fact that while we're discussing EMP and they want to downplay a high altitude electromagnetic pulse, they can't downplay Mother Nature. And it's going to happen at some point. I hope not in my lifetime. But a forcing event, May 10th, 2 years ago, I was on a call right before that with the Foundation for Infrastructure Resilience. We were having solar storms that were 25% of the strength of the Carrington event. The northern lights were visible in Florida and in Texas. Very unusual. I was flying off on my delayed honeymoon to Turks and Caicos May 10th, and because I remember solar radiation is really high in a solar storm, and we shouldn't be flying. And there's a chance, if it's strong enough, that it could bring down satellites and maybe even bring down aircraft. So I warned my wife about that on the call right before, when the solar storms and the magnitude was being discussed, I said, I almost wish that we would have a forcing effect from a solar storm that would just take down the internet, just take it down for 72 hours. and see how the country screams in agony and pain, and all those lawmakers that don't have cell service, and that don't have their GPS on their cars, and they can't get to the county barbecues that they're driving to give their speeches because they don't have maps anymore. They don't know how to get there. I almost wish for a small event that would be a forcing event to wake everybody up, that all of a sudden they don't have maybe their cable TV or their internet, or their podcast they can't perform, or even the simplest of chores. Their ATM doesn't work. My goodness, let's shut down all the ATMs in America just for 4 days or so and see if people are screaming or not, and they would be. A forcing event that's mild in effect would be probably a good thing to bring attention to this issue, short of Congress and the administration not doing their job. Let's pray that they do so, and we're making progress. And you're getting the word out there through this podcast is one critical component of that. We have a grid podcast that one of our FUR members does, Maria Sumnick, every Wednesday, I think, and feel free to tune into that. And you can access that through the foundation, fur.foundation.org, through our website. And you can go back and look at some of the past podcasts that she's done on this as well. There's a group called the Center for Security Policy. There are 4 or 5 groups, coalition. We have a coalition of EMP groups. Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller is the president of the Center for Security Policy. He does a great job. He's out there in the states fighting for state legislation all over the place. We have 4 or 5 EMP groups that have formed the coalition. We have about 80,000 to 100,000 members of these organizations. I'm calling them into action this coming Friday with an action alert to contact their legislators. And I'd be glad to share that with you. And if you can share that with your podcast members, get the word out. We need Congress to hear that they need to address this issue, and the administration.
Yeah, please do share that, and we'll post a link to the podcast that you mentioned. We'll make sure we post that too. Jim, you look like you had something.
No, I was just going to say I just Googled Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller and President and CEO of Center for Security Policy, as you pointed out, Rob, and we'd love to get in touch with him for a future episode as well for other security topics.
Yeah, Tommy's been doing a great job on this issue for years. Before him, Frank Gaffney, who was the president of that organization. Frank recently retired. Down in South Carolina, Jim, we have one of our FUR members who's a historic figure, is Ambassador Hank Cooper. Lives outside of Charleston. Hank is on our weekly FUR calls, Foundation for Infrastructure Resilience. Hank was Ronald Reagan's SDI ambassador, basically. He worked with General Graham to put together the whole Reagan SDI program years ago. And Hank is still kicking strong. He's still a great advocate and working very hard with your South Carolina legislators. And, he might be a great interview for you to talk about space weapons, SDI, some of the things that are going on that he was part of the founder of. And there's some technologies I mentioned to Marcus before we got on this call that are coming out of the research from SDI that are going to revolutionize power going forward. Maybe we can have a podcast or a discussion about that at a later time. There are some life-changing, game-changing technologies in the background in AI, in electric power generation, and energy AI that I'm aware of that are going to be really game changers for society. Similar to microchips being invented, that kind of impact on our economy and on our energy needs and production is in the pipeline.
So, and this starts to get complicated, pretty quick. So, in your position, what's your 30 to 60-second elevator speech if you've got, just a second of a congressman's attention or a senator? What do you tell them? How do you explain this quickly?
Say, Congressman, I'm Vice President of Public Policy for the Foundation for Infrastructure Resilience. I'm sure you've heard about electromagnetic pulse and I'm sure you've heard about solar weather and the capability of solar weather or an EMP from bringing down our national grid. This is an issue that can no longer wait. We've studied it to death. 2 EMP commissions, a presidential EMP executive order that was upheld by our opposite party in opposition by the Biden administration. And we know how to do it now. We know how much it's going to cost. Can you take an effort to protect the grid and protect your citizens from the most horrible, imaginative catastrophe that could ever happen to this country? That's
Compelling. That's quick. You've practiced that.
I've said it a few times in elevators, by the way. Actually,
They call it that for a reason.
I got into an elevator with a senior member on the appropriations committee, and I gave him that exact speech. And he said, "Come by and see me in my office. I'd like to talk about this." I said, "Thank you, Congressman." Then I went and saw him, and he's willing to help. But members of the appropriations committee are going through a process where they have portals open on their websites where people make requests for money. And big defense contractors come in and they say, "Yeah, we need to up this account by $100 million this year or by $1 billion." And so these congressmen are under siege with quite literally thousands of requests for money. And you wonder why we have a national debt problem that we have. They have powerful constituents, powerful companies that are coming to them. But not one of those people, other than me and maybe Tommy Waller, are coming to them and saying, "You need to put money in to protect the national grid and to protect our military bases against electromagnetic pulse attack." Because, the congressmen, we're constituents. The only people that can make a difference in getting EMP addressed are the people that listen to your podcasts, that care about this country, that love this country, that want to protect their families, their neighbors, their communities, and they need to act. They need to give that elevator speech all around the United States. Absent that or a forcing effect, some catastrophe taking place, I still don't see it happening as quickly as it needs to happen. Eventually, but we may not have the time.
I mean, this is, or at least it should be, a bipartisan issue. This is not political in any way.
Mhm.
So with all of the things you said being true, we now know what to do, so they don't have that excuse.
Mhm.
So we have the technology, we have the expertise. So other than money, which is always a problem,
Mhm.
who opposes this effort to harden the grid, and why, other than just the expense, which, as you already pointed out, is a lot less than dealing with the aftermath?
You brought up a great point. The electric utility industry to this point have not been players in this and have not wanted to end up eating the cost of doing this. So we need to incentivize them to move more rapidly. If we allowed the base rate to include costs for recovery, and I'm trying to get a paper written on this right now about affordability is a huge issue in the country right now, and people are getting electric bills doubling their costs now on their electric bills. So what are the components that are going into those increases in your electricity bill? Well, we mentioned AI, electric vehicles, climate regulations, a huge impact, and grid modernization and EMP protection isn't one yet. But what size of a component would that be? It would cost less than 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour to protect the nationwide grid. About $250 billion is what our calculation is. And if you put that in the base rate, it's about a 4% increase in your electric utility bills. Not a doubling of the bills that we've seen from AI and from data centers and from climate regulations. 4% would fix and harden the grid in the United States against electromagnetic pulse. The utilities don't want to have to pay for that 4% unless they're allowed to recuperate that in their base rate. So they probably should be. After COVID, I guess the utilities, it was during cyber attacks that they were having. They were allowed to recover the cost of protecting their facilities against cyber attacks in the base rate from an emergency executive order, I think, or an order from FERC, Federal Electric Regulatory Commission. What we're asking for, and Congress gave them the power, for the authorization to protect against cyber attacks on our grid. We need to do the same thing on electromagnetic pulse, and then have FERC be able to have tell the electric utilities, harden your facilities against EMP, and will allow you to recover that in your rate base. So that's another step that we're trying to take place. There's multiple committees of jurisdiction too. You saw all those 16 infrastructures in there. It affects every aspect of American society. So food, agriculture, logistics, transportation, energy, fuel, the grid, water. Every committee in the Congress has a piece of this issue. I went in to see a Hill staffer that lived in Woodbridge, Virginia, where I reside, that worked for Senator Tillis from North Carolina. And he was a Marine, by the way. And I went in and wanted to brief him as a friend and on this issue. And he said, well, Rob, this issue doesn't have anything to do with Senator Tillis. He's on the Financial Services Committee. And I said, well, when the grid goes down and there's no ATMs and there's no stock market and there's no trading and there's no movement of capital across the entire country, isn't that a concern of his? And he said, yeah, you're right. I probably need to brief him on this. And I said, please do. It's an issue that overrides every single committee in the Congress. And yet, the committees that are of paramount importance, the energy committees and the armed services committees, to protect our grid and to protect our nation. And if we don't have an armed military bases and a military capability because there's a grid down situation, then we can't protect our nation. So there's priorities. Spend the money where it's needed most, spend it wisely. The technologies exist, as you said, and it's not that expensive. And then allow the utilities to become players in this whole thing, do it right, and protect not only the transmission grid, but the distribution grid, all the way down to the consumer. And they're putting smart meters on a house, which they've all been trying to do to regulate and measure the amount of electricity that's being utilized. Harden those smart meters so that the power lines come into the house. You're going to protect the electronic circuits in every household in the country. I know the Israelis put bomb shelters requirements in every home that they built in Israel, probably wisely so. They weren't all engineered the way they should have been engineered. Let's require that as we upgrade, modernize our grid, modernize our electric systems, which we have to do to take this huge new energy requirement that we have. Let's do it in a way that's smart and protects us against solar weather and EMP at the same time.
Who on Capitol Hill are the primary obstacles? Who stands in the way of getting this done?
I would say it's the staff on the committees. That might get me in some hot water here, but when the member of the committee of the electricity, of the grid committee, of the energy committee in the House, falls over to his staff, who used to work with the electric utility industry, by the way, and he says, hey, I had this guy come in and see me about EMP. What are we doing to protect ourselves against EMP? Well, it's not going to happen. And the utilities have it covered. We still have this situation where a lot of the professional staff members on the committees, I think the Democratic staff on the Senate Armed Services Committee understands this issue and is very up to speed on it. And I give one person over there a lot of credit. He used to work for my chief scientist in my firm, by the way, but he understands the issue. But some of the other staff, and I got to tell you, there's a lot of junior staff on the Hill too. On the Energy Committee, I calculated, I met with every single member and staff that I could on the Energy Committees, Energy and Commerce Committee in particular in the House. We have a champion there, Congresswoman Diana Harshbarger from Tennessee, is great on the issue, really wants to get some things done. I think has been stymied by the staff and the energy industry. But 75% of the staff members on the Energy and Commerce Committee that I met with had never heard of the Carrington event, which was the largest solar storm that hit North America in our history when we had telegraphs that got blown out all over the United States. Thank God we had no electrical infrastructure then. That would have brought the entire grid down in the United States. But the professional staff for these members on the committee that hadn't heard of the Carrington event and didn't know that a solar storm could bring down the grid was just startling. I'd say 10% of or maybe 15% of the military staff on the HASC and the SASC had heard of Starfish Prime, the satellite killing EMP that our U.S. military laid on us in Hawaii in 1962.
Mhm.
And if you Google things these days, if you use AI, and you ask that question about the Russian, the Chinese grid, but you ask it about our grid, and you say, should we harden our U.S. grid against EMP? AI will come back and say, no, the likelihood of an EMP is very small. AI doesn't know about localized EMP yet. You can train AI, and we'll be training AI to understand some of these threats are much more serious than they know about. And one of the reasons why AI came back and said we really should try to harden against EMP is because of liability for the electric utility industry. If the industry knows that there's a threat from solar weather or an EMP, and they don't act to harden their facilities, and we have a grid down situation that costs tens of thousands of lives, let alone millions of lives, they could be liable because they knew and should have known that they could have a grid down situation that would kill hundreds, thousands, or possibly millions of their customers, and they did nothing. So if you do
Yeah.
nothing and you don't acknowledge that the problem exists, and no federal body regulator is telling you have to do it, you're kind of protected. You're not going to be liable unless you start the process and you start hardening, recognizing the impact. So AI it was startling when we got that solution from AI saying, well, they probably shouldn't do it because it could cost them millions of billions of dollars in liability. Crazy.
I guess AI hasn't figured out self-preservation completely yet.
Yeah.
Doesn't understand why its own existence depends on this.
Yeah. How ironic.
Right now, anyway.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
part of the issue is what you're saying is the plausible scenario that people can't wrap their mind around or can't think of a plausible scenario. You mentioned mutually assured destruction, like, oh, no nation would do this to us because of mutually assured destruction. Well, 9/11 belies that. Obviously, so there's all kinds of terrorist threats out there, and of course, with Iran, being very likely and wanting to retaliate right now as we speak, and who knows what kind of cells are inside the United States from all the massive illegal immigration over the last few years. And knowing that an EMP attack doesn't have to be a ballistically launched missile, it can be a ground-based electromagnetic pulse on key weak points, which is, again, open source. We've been probed already by enemy actors on the ground at different bases, different substations, things like that. And I can think of a scenario right now where China would want to do this. And you mentioned, Rob, President Xi's desire to take over Taiwan at some point. And I'll just going to read a few lines from several of his speeches. January 2nd, 2019, he said, the country must be and will surely be reunified. Reunification is the historical trend and is the right path, reunified with Taiwan. In 2021, he said, resolving the Taiwan question and realizing China's complete reunification is a historic mission and an unshakable commitment of the Communist Party of China. We will uphold the One China principle and advance peaceful national reunification, he says. In October 9th, 2021, he said the historical task of the complete reunification of the motherland must be fulfilled and will definitely be fulfilled. In 2024, he said the reunification of the motherland is a historical inevitability. In 2025, the reunification of our motherland, a trend of the times, is unstoppable. And it's reported that, and I think you mentioned 2027, them being ready to do that, and our, again, open source claims that he has directed the People's Liberation Army, PLA, to be capable of invading Taiwan by 2027. Not that he will, but to be capable of it. And so my context would be, if he knows, especially if we have a president that he knows will stand up to him and prevent him from doing that if he wants to do it. And we know, by the way, one of the incentives that is driving him or the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, from wanting to do that is their demographic decline is inevitable.
Mhm.
Their economy, their population, everything's coming together in a bad way for China right now. It's going to hurt their economy big time, and so I think Taiwan is a hedge against that to some extent. That's my theory. So there's motivation besides just historical precedents, all that kind of stuff, for them to want to do this at some point in the relatively near future. And wow, what a way to distract America and create its own problems if there was an EMP attack in America of
Oh,
some
it would be
kind right before.
more than distraction.
Yeah,
Why are the Chinese
yeah,
buying all this property close to military bases, strategic bases?
right,
Barksdale now has drones flying over it. You know, if there's a localized capability of launching an EMP and shorting out all the power distribution stations to our military bases, hidden on property where you can't see anybody, bad actors doing this kind of thing, which could be done. Why are they buying this property next to our bases? Why are we allowing them to do it?
yep,
Some states are acting, but no, you're right. 2027 and what China is heading towards right now, the easiest way to take the U.S. out of being involved in the Taiwanese situation in trying to stop that. And also, if Russia ever dared to do it, to take us from out of helping Ukraine and coming to the assistance of Europe, would be either localized EMP or an EMP launched from balloons, like the scenario in, China launched the balloon over the U.S. already, that we all know about that. The scenario in 1 second after. Balloons from a freighter in the Gulf of Mexico, one east of the Rockies, west of the Rockies, and east of the Rockies. And you take down the grid in the United States and you don't know who did it. It came from some freighter in the Gulf of Mexico, and and you don't need a very big electromagnetic pulse explosion in the upper atmosphere. 75 kilometers up, and you cover 1,000 miles, and it takes down all the grid and all the networks within those 2,000-mile radius. That brings down the grid in the United States. So, what better way to cripple us, other than the fact that you've just committed war crimes against 100 million Americans, and we're going to be darn ticked off eventually when we recover, and we will. But it's just a horrible scenario, and one that could very possibly happen from terrorist actors, not necessarily state actors. And we know Iran is probably the most aggressive of those opponents of the United States. Could be the Houthi rebels too. It could be any group that is out to kill us, Al Qaeda, ISIS, any of those that managed to get a hold of a suitcase bomb could put us out of commission.
So would you say then China is the nation state EMP capability that most concerns you?
Yeah, China. Yeah, I actually read one of your questions ahead of time, and I thought of that very carefully. The nation state would be China, and a rogue nation that operates through terrorist proxies would be Iran. Either one of them is a dire threat to the United States and a dire threat in terms of utilization of EMP. And the Chinese are very smart. They could definitely do it through proxies and do it without us knowing where it came from. At least initially, you can track radioisotopes and you can figure out where that nuclear fissionable material was made, but it takes quite a while to do that. And then again, who knows, whether that enriched uranium came from underground in Iran, and we didn't have radioisotope knowledge of what they were building and how they were putting it together. I'm not a nuclear expert, but I know you can track that kind of thing. But if it's new and if it's coming from somewhere where you had no idea where it was being made, maybe not.
What is Advanced Fusion Systems, and what is your connection with them?
Yeah, it's a company. They're a client now. And Dr. William H. Joyce is the chairman of Advanced Fusion Systems. He was chairman of Union Carbide Corporation, chairman of vice chairman of Dow, chairman of Hercules, and chairman of what's the other company? The water company. I'm losing track there. He founded Advanced Fusion Systems. He put $250 million of his own money into AFS, Advanced Fusion Systems, to come up with a solution to combat EMP. He's a brilliant scientist, hugely successful. His polyethylene is in every undersea cable line in across the world, protecting undersea cables, insulating them, and in our electric transmission lines as well. He's a patriot, and he's 90 years old now. He comes to Washington. I'm taking him around the halls of Congress, taking him into the Department of Energy. AFS is the leading company on mid-level surge protection up to the transmission level for protecting the distribution grid. And they have an inexpensive device that he started out, and the devices that he was going to create were 65,000 or 70,000 a piece, and he said that's never going to work. We have to make it affordable. Basically, his devices will sense an EMP current coming at the speed of light, in fact, faster than the speed of light, in 0.2 of a nanosecond. And he'll sense the EMP pulse coming down the electric lines, and he'll shunt the line to the ground and ground that power, 97% of that power to the ground. The other 3% isn't going to burn out everything. And so he's perfected it. We're actually, it's been tested at Sandia Labs. It's been tested at Idaho National Labs and by Boeing, their Little Mountain facility. And we're actually giving them now away some of the surge protection to the U.S. military and to some of our electric utilities to test over a period of time. Not only does it stop EMP, and it goes in parallel with the lightning protection, but it also has the ability to eliminate dirty power and spikes in power systems that cost our electrical equipment across the United States as much as $900 billion a year. When you get these spikes, every time your computer has to reboot, and every time your television or your clocks go out on your home and you got to reset them, that's a spike in the power that's occurred, possibly from a lightning strike or from a localized grid out situation that lasts for under 5 minutes. There's thousands of those, and every time those happen, the power company can't charge for electricity, so it loses billions and billions of dollars. And then the equipment is damaged every time there's a spike. So if you install the surge protection across the United States on our distribution grid and eliminated that dirty power and those spikes from data centers too, which I was really talking about earlier, you're going to save a huge amount of money from having to replace this electrical equipment much sooner, and consumers as well. How many times has a computer motherboard fried out in a situation where you had a lightning strike close by, or where you just had a power out situation? Because when the power comes back on, you can even hear it in your HVAC system sometimes. When the HVAC kicks on, you hear this loud, power surge and loud noise from the electrical system kicking on. That damages the components after a time. I think Dr. Joyce uses a conversion of about 33%, 40%. Every time you have a serious power spike, you degrade the system over time. And lightning arresters degrade over time too. After they've been hit by lightning a few times or help protect the system from lightning, they wear out too.
So, Advanced Fusion Systems, they developed this and tested this E1 protective device that you've been describing. And I read a little bit about that. And it's described, at least in the white paper, as an ultra-fast surge arrestor.
Correct.
That runs in parallel with lightning protection. And he said it can detect and shunt within 0.2, 0.3 of a nanosecond.
Of a nanosecond. Yeah.
Okay. Because we were talking to Wes Morgan last week, and he was telling us that an E1 waveform travels it's 1,000 times faster than lightning.
Correct.
And so, but this ultra fast surge arrestor can catch that?
Yes. That's one of the key patents that they have, and the capability of detecting that current coming down the line. Usually it's between 150,000 and 300,000 volts that's coming down that power line. And that's followed by 5,000 amps of power or more. That what the voltage doesn't get in that quick surge, the amperage is going to come back behind it and melt it. So it's extremely high levels of power. So the whole thought about this whole process is being able to detect it quickly enough and shun it to the ground, take it away from the electrical circuits that you're protecting. And as I said, it's been thoroughly tested.
And how much does one of those cost?
About $6,000 a year to buy one retail. If we were going to be protecting an entire military base with government best prices, GSA prices, and they're on the GSA, by the way, you could probably get them down in the $4,000 to $5,000 range. And if you buy them in quantity, mass produced. Fairfax Water is using them, by the way, which is one entity close to us that is protected. They're pumping stations. But this technology was only developed after $250 million in year 10 of 12 years that advanced fusion's been in existence. Dr. Joyce kids about his own capability, saying, well, it took me a restart in 10 years before I did it, but I finally got it done. But just a remarkable company, remarkable man that's going to have a major impact on protecting this country.
How many of those arresters would we need?
For the military, $10.4 billion worth. I mentioned that number earlier to protect our military bases, the critical electronic circuits on our military bases and the distribution lines coming into those bases. I don't have a number off the top of my head, Marcus, in terms of the actual numbers. I do have an Excel spreadsheet where I think that number's inserted into it, but off the top of my head, I can't remember right now. But I can get those numbers to you and to the Congress.
Yeah, that'd be great. Because you mentioned that this really pays for itself over time, and you kind of explained some of the math already. That the lack of protection costs in the neighborhood of $900 billion a year.
A year. And solar storms cost $10 billion a year to the electric utility industry for damaged equipment. Hardly anybody ever brings that up. That's only $10 billion, $900 billion from lightning and electric spikes and grid down situations where you got to reboot everything.
Wow. It's pretty astronomical numbers. Hard to wrap your mind around those numbers.
Yeah, it is. It is. Although, as a former House Ways and Means Committee staffer, those numbers should faze me. They really don't that much, because Ways and Means
we wasted more on less important things.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
So what was your reaction in 2023 when this Chinese spy balloon started tracking over continental U.S.? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, my first thought was heaven, hope that it does not include high altitude electromagnetic capability. And then why the heck did we let it get across our border and go all the way down to the Atlantic Ocean? Why didn't we shoot it down sooner? And what did we do to tell the Chinese, if you ever do this again, there's going to be consequences? I was shocked. I think a lot of people were shocked. And was it a test? Was it the first effort to say, hey, I wonder how the U.S. is going to react to this? And what if we did use a hemp on one of those balloons? How's it going to work? That balloon scenario, like 1 second after, scares me more than almost anything, because we can't retaliate if we don't know where it came from. Now we track the Chinese balloon to China, but what if it was launched from Vancouver, on a ship that came into harbor there, and we didn't know who owned the ship? It was licensed under some African Liberian tanker company. How long is it going to take for us to find out, especially if we don't have any power and any capabilities to respond? It could take us months and months and months and cost hundreds of millions of lives.
I don't know if you had a chance to watch the last two episodes, but did you see that side-by-side comparison of the chart that was presented to Congress in 1997?
I did.
Set next to the trajectory of that balloon.
Yep.
And it's funny because the chart that was presented to Congress in 1997, that dashed line, doesn't really represent a a track of a flight path or anything. It's just connecting the concentric circles.
Right.
But it's interesting. I don't know if it's just a freak coincidence that the balloon tracked right down that dotted line.
Yeah.
Almost. It's weird.
One of the other things that took place that was not a coincidence was when the Soviet Union decided to test EMP. They chose a location, I think in Kazakhstan, that was the exact same geomagnetic location as Washington, D.C. So we don't think that that was a coincidence of the EMP testing that they did. And former Congressman Chris Stewart, I had a meeting with him and my chief scientist, Dr. Will Reese, on my consulting team. I have 108 consultants around the world. And Reese was he ran Los Alamos National Laboratory. He founded Science and Technology for Tom Ridge when he became Secretary of Homeland Security. And Reese ran the Department of Defense Labs. And when he did that and ran DARPA, he met Congressman Stewart, who was a B-1 bomber pilot and has also written books on EMP, by the way. So we went in to brief him on the need to protect our military bases, and he was a huge advocate. He walked in and he said, I'm just coming back from a classified briefing on Russia's capabilities with nuclear weapons and space weapons. And I can't tell you anything about it other than to tell you I am scared to death. And so we had the meeting, and reading between the lines and talking to Dr. Reese and then talking to another scientist on my team. The other scary thing that's out there are directed energy weapons and nuclear weapons in space. I guess our House Intel chairman disclosed that Russia had nukes in space. I think he got into some hot water for that. He wasn't supposed to discuss it. Are the nukes in space because they're going to launch EMP in space and take out all our satellite capabilities? Well, they take out their own if they did that too. What other purpose are nuclear capabilities in space offering other than directed energy weapons that can be focused here on the United States? And again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I asked Dr. Mum on my staff, my scientist that heads up my national security division. One time I said, well, Dr. Mum, we've had 21 food processing plants in the United States that have caught fire in the last 6 months. I said, at what point, what number does it go from a coincidence to a certainty that there's something going on that we're not talking about, that we don't know about? And he said, well, Rob, I'd say 5 would be a major coincidence. I'd say 10 or 15 would be an indicator that there's something very serious going on. And 21, well, you can, judge for yourself what's going on. And I said, well, let me ask another question without, you divulging any he was on the National Security Council staff, without divulging any top secrets. And I said, would it be plausible to think that perhaps a directed energy weapon from space could be to blame for starting random fires? I think you recall that even 4 or 5 presidential limousines in Inner Harbor, Baltimore, caught fire spontaneously at some point too, a year and a half ago or so, and which could have been a direct signal to perhaps the President of the United States that, hey, we know how to take your limos out. So, I just have questions. And one response came back to me from Dr. Mum that stuck with me. And he said, well, there's a documented incidents of hundreds of thousands of birds falling out of the sky in New Jersey. And he said, and it's not classified. And he said it was an experiment that went wrong in the United States. And I said, oh, so we used some kind of directed energy weapon and we shot it into the atmosphere and we took out thousands of birds flying overhead. And he said, I cannot confirm or deny that, but it's public information. And so I Googled it at the time and didn't find, I found the incident where the birds were all falling out of the sky, singed and not in any good health. But I haven't followed up and researched that. EMP, number one existential threat. Is it going to come from a balloon? Is it going to come from a solar storm? Is it going to come from directed weapons in space or EMP, electromagnetic warfare from space? What is almost certain is that it's going to happen at some point, and we need to be prepared. Preparedness is the most important thing that can defer an attack. If our adversaries know that we're prepared and that our grid is hardened and that we understand what the threat is, it's much, much less likely to ever happen. If our adversary is the sun and a strong solar storm, then they don't care. It doesn't care one way or the other. We need to be prepared for solar weather too. So with the fact that as much as 90% of our population could be killed in an EMP incident or a strong solar storm, and we know that solar storms will hit, why aren't we speeding up this process to protect our population? It's absurd and it's insane not to do it. Now that we know how, and we know that it's not going to cost an arm and a leg, it's going to cost a very small portion of our budget, $250 billion. The defense budget by itself is going to be over $1 trillion this year, we know. So, and out of our whole economy of, $1.8 trillion or what, I'm not sure what the number is at this point. It's money that we have to spend and spend wisely.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be all at once. It could be spaced out, over a few years.
Phased in, actually, to do it right.
Yeah.
Prioritize what you need to protect first. And as you go in and modernize the grid, and as you change out the old lightning arresters, just put in the surge protection at the same time, and one facility at a time over years, and we'll get there.
The calculus that the bean counters are no doubt using is that it's low likelihood, at least in their estimation, very expensive to guard against a low likelihood but high impact type of an event. But what I'm hearing from you and what I read in Advanced Fusion's paper is that it's maybe not as unlikely as we think. Okay, sure, there's only a handful of state actors in the world that have the capability to even build the nuclear weapon that could pull it off, much less put it on a satellite or some vehicle and put it into low Earth orbit, 300 miles above the Earth's surface. But what is more likely, and I'm kind of surprised it hasn't happened yet, are these non-state actors, terrorist activity, sabotage, and you'd mentioned localized EMPs, how that is a far more likely scenario, according to Advanced Fusion, much easier to pull off, but potentially just as devastating. So can you talk about localized EMPs a little bit?
Yeah. So Iran has already given Hezbollah a localized EMP weapon that will only cover about 4 or 5 kilometers. But if you launched enough of them at the Israeli border, for instance, you could shut down the electric fences, you could shut down your communications, you could shut down any of your electronic systems that you have there if they weren't hardened. I believe the Israelis have done a pretty good job on hardening their stuff. Now, if that technology was smuggled into the United States, and that's a non-nuclear technology, that is a high capacitor charge that is detonated with the high explosives and creates a huge localized electromagnetic pulse. There are other devices that could be built that could infuse those electronic pulses into our power lines, into our distribution grid, into our military bases. And if you had 3 or 4 teams that had the knowledge of how to do it, and they did it in key locations, 4 substations would take down all of New York City, and substations close to our military bases could take down our military bases power as well, using localized EMP. And Dr. Joyce at AFS thinks that's a much more likely scenario. In terms of spending money and forcing events again, after 9/11, I wonder how much money we spent to build all of the magnometers in every airport in the United States and create all the infrastructure for airport security and for security at our borders around the entire country. I wonder what that total amount of money was. And if we can spend that money, that amount now, I'll bet it's less than what we could harden the entire grid in the United States with. That, what happened at 9/11 caused us to change our way of life. and we only lost 3,500 Americans, I think, something roughly in that neighborhood at 9/11. What happens if we lose 90 million and we hadn't spent the amount of money that was spent on airport infrastructure security? How would we feel as a country? How would our leaders feel? What would we be able to tell our children or our grandchildren in the future, that we had the chance to protect 1/3 of our population or more, 90% according to one of the EMP Commission reports? We had the chance to do it. We knew how to do it, but we chose not to spend the money because we didn't think it would happen. Well, your worst case scenario eventually is probably going to happen. And certainly, again, by the sun, if not by adversaries.
That's a compelling argument. So for these localized EMPs, if they are, as you said, fairly inexpensive, not difficult to build, very effective, why do you think it hasn't happened yet?
I don't think the knowledge about them is as widespread as it is possibly getting to be now. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to build them. They're relatively inexpensive. I don't think it's happened yet. Hopefully, because our intelligence agencies have done a pretty good job at lining up and exploiting cells that we don't know about what they've done. I think it's only a matter of time, though, before something like this happens. And why it hasn't happened as of yet, I think probably because the technology is relatively new and we haven't discussed it too much. I'm not discussing a lot about the technical details of it now on purpose. I have to tell you, though, when I was with the National Disaster Resilience Council, which I'm proud to have named, by the way, when we were trying to first discuss these issues on Capitol Hill, there was an organization called InfraGard, which is a nationwide organization of security professionals. And the FBI is a parent company kind of agency interacting with InfraGard. We were told that we shouldn't be discussing EMP in the Congress and on Capitol Hill because we didn't want to draw attention to the issue. And we certainly shouldn't be discussing it in public. Now, the FBI is telling us that it's importantly critical that we not tip our adversaries off to how vulnerable we are on EMP. What are they doing about it? And why are they telling us to keep our mouths shut if they weren't worried about it themselves? Broke off from InfraGard, the National Disaster Resilience Council, and all of our scientists and all of our top management left, founded the Foundation for Infrastructure Resilience, because we were being told that we couldn't talk about this critically important issue from one of our key national security agencies that is in charge of making sure it doesn't happen. Really very disturbing and distressing. And at that point in time was making all sorts of pretty radical decisions, and hopefully we're getting back on track.
Well, especially because it's public knowledge, it's open source. Trump's executive order from 2019, the congressional reports. I mean, it's out there. It's not like it's a secret. Is it widely known? Probably not. No, because the average, member of the American public doesn't read this kind of stuff normally. Don't want to worry about this kind of thing, but it's not like it's not open source information.
There was Fox News ran an article about a year and a half to 2 years ago from a George Mason University scientist that I happen to know, Dr. Peter Becker, did a press release and released a study about what would happen if solar storms made the internet go out. And it was kind of a nationally picked up headline. And I started making a point of the fact that, the American public, it got their attention. And it was a widely distributed article and press release. And Peter Becker was on national news media talking about the demise of the internet from a solar storm. Well, what in the heck? The last question to him was, well, how bad could it be? Is it just the internet that would go down in a solar storm? And he said, Oh no, it could be far worse than that. And we're talking about catastrophic internet loss for our youth and our kids that wouldn't be able to download their Spotify music anymore, when it really could be a mass destruction event in the entire United States. And I was just amazed at how the media didn't pick up on it until the last question was asked. Well, if the solar storm was strong enough to take down the internet, what else could it take down? And then it was like, oh, it could be far worse than that.
Mm-hmm.
Got a question about since you deal with trying to craft, policy ideas for Congress to take on to address this. Seems to me like for years now, especially under the Biden administration, Obama administration, has been all kinds of policy directed around tax tax incentives for solar power companies and things like that, and for electric vehicles and things like that. Is a feasible avenue for Congress to consider a tax incentive for power companies and power providers to give them a tax break to compel them, if they develop resilience and resistance from EMP threats, because
Yeah, we
we all
support
know. Yeah,
we support
go
an
ahead.
investment tax credit for hardening facilities, not only for the electric utility industry, but for anybody that is going to harden their facilities. We support an investment tax credit.
That seems like by far the most efficient way to do this, because private industry will find out the most efficient way to do this, instead of the government spending money, more money. Not that we don't also have to do that, especially on the Department of War side of things and other parts of our infrastructure that are, government owned or public owned. But on the private side, man, just give some tax incentives and let them go crazy.
I would hope so, although how many people would spend it if they didn't think it was that much of a threat? You know,
Yeah.
I have some devices protecting my house and my car. I have friends that have protected their whole infrastructure of their homes, propane, refrigerators and all sorts of, you know, um, protection for everything in their homes. And it gets pretty costly, but not many people will spend the money on that. And even if there's a tax credit, they have to really see the threat, I think, to be motivated.
So if you could pass one law tomorrow,
Mhm.
what would it be?
I would. There's one law and one executive order. If I were the
Okay.
president of the United States, I would issue an executive order to appoint a grid czar to coordinate the modernization and hardening of our national grid with every agency that needs to be involved with protecting our infrastructure, and start with our most critical military infrastructures. And the Foundation for Infrastructure Resilience has that executive order drafted, and we're circulating that in the halls of Congress and in the administration. The law that I would pass would be to require the electric utility industry to harden the national grid within a certain period of time, um, and to be able to pass along that cost to consumers in the base rate. And that's the simplest and fastest way to do it. And because the electric utility industry is reluctant to go that route, and they're already under extreme pressure because of AI and data centers, and they're looking at energy transmission and a demand as the key issue facing them. They're not looking at hardening their facilities or even modernizing the grid and protecting it as much as they are of being able to produce more electricity. The more we produce, if we don't have the capability of distributing it or transmitting it, it's not going to matter. And that's a very real threat that they need to address. And there's 300 or 400 of their lobbyists up on Capitol Hill every week, and there's one or two of us, myself, Tommy Waller, maybe General Reiner on the FER team, and we're not being paid several $100,000 a year by utilities to do their lobbying and do their bidding. I don't think all the utilities are bad. I don't think there's just no coordination at the national level of protecting and modernizing our grid. And that's what we need more than anything. So it's an executive order from the president and an appointment of a grid czar, somebody to oversee it. I have a candidate currently at the Federal Electric Regulatory Commission that I think would be great. He is absolutely so knowledgeable about this issue and recognizes the threat, and they have some really great people there. But they're only overseeing the transmission side of things and the generation side of things. They don't go all the way down to the consumer level or to the distribution grid. We have NERC, we have FERC, we have every 50 state corporation commissions and utility oversight organizations. And it is just a mishmash that can't be controlled unless there's some national grid czar that's appointed to oversee it all. And that's what we need.
And that was actually directed by the executive order, but it hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened. And the EMP executive order, even though it's codified in the law in several locations, DHS and our military, moving at a snail's pace. There's a military base in San Antonio, Texas, and a pilot demonstration program called Joint Base San Antonio. I'm on a call with them at 2:00 today. That they were directed to be an experiment of a community joining with the military to harden its facilities and harden its capabilities against electromagnetic pulse. Came out of that executive order. They've gotten, I believe, less than $200,000 in 7 years of funding for that effort. So we're going to be talking to them today about donating equipment to them that we can measure the productivity, the ability to defeat EMP by installing it for free, donating this equipment to our U.S. military. And I hope the call goes well. I hope we can help them.
I hope it does too.
But it's money that we should be spending from our defense budget. And even if the military bases were allowed to require the utilities that are providing them with power to make sure that power was hardened, that they would be guaranteed that power. They should be guaranteed that power. They're paying for that power every day. We'll put in their contracts that they have to be ensured that that power would be delivered in a solar storm or an electromagnetic pulse attack, and then allow the utilities to charge an uprated fee in the baseline of the power that they send to the military base, so that the military would pay for it over time in its base rate on the power that it's consuming. That's another idea that's out there that makes sense.
It's the old proverb, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Mm-hmm. In this case,
So
worth 100 million lives.
Yeah, the stakes are astronomical.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you've obviously put in a lot of time and effort, and the organizations you're a part of have. But the deck is kind of stacked against us at the moment. But are you optimistic about the next 5 years?
I'm optimistic about this year that we're going to start the process, at least in the military, that needs to be started. I have to say that 2027 and China's threats about Taiwan are happening much sooner than 5 years. I think we need to speed up this process enormously. And 2 EMP commissions, constant calling attention to this issue, presidential executive orders, and still going at a snail's pace. I have to say I'm a little skeptical about whether we're going to get to where we need to be in time. But I'm not for 1 second going to diminish my efforts, or the people in our foundation and the national experts on this issue are going to keep pounding the pavement, pounding the media, and trying to get the attention of our administration and our lawmakers to get something done substantial.
Wow. Well, thank you for what you're doing there. What role should citizens play in this resiliency effort, and what can they do to support the actions that you're taking?
They can call or write their congressman. Frankly, I would call. You get more attention when you place a phone call, and the staff are supposed to log in that phone call and log in what the issue is. I guess, members of the citizens in the community that know their members of Congress, that know their senators, go out on the trail when they're having a town hall meeting and raise the issue and say, Senator, Congressman, what are you doing about protecting this country against solar weather or electromagnetic pulse? And put them on the spot and see what they have to say. And, are they going to acknowledge the problem? Almost all of them have acknowledged the issue and the problem in meetings with me and our foundation. Are they going to take actions to address it? Very few of them have. Some have. So we have a couple champions. I'll just mention them again. Congressman Rob Whitman from Virginia, Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, Congresswoman Diana Harshbarger from Tennessee, Congressman and Sheriff John Rutherford from Nassau County, Florida. Some of the leaders in the Congress that really care about this issue, and there are others. And we just we need to contact them. We need our podcast listeners to contact them. We need our citizens that understand the issue and the threats to contact them and ask them to take solid action to protect the national grid and protect our ability to defend ourselves.
Absolutely. Well, we would encourage everybody to do that. And hopefully this episode and the previous two have at least solidified it in people's mind what the threat is, and that it's very real and not as unlikely as they might expect. Multiple ways this could happen, either through that high altitude EMP, which granted there's only a few actors who could do that. Solar storms, which NASA predicted there's a 12% chance per decade that a Carrington type event could happen. And as you said, happens every 200 years, and we're now, 150 plus? Can't do math in public. So the odds are not in our favor that we're going to get through even our lifetimes without something like that happening. And we've seen it, as you described, on a smaller scale. You said 25% or so of what they saw during that Carrington event we've seen in the last few years. And then the most likely, as highlighted by Advanced Fusion and you, and I think from the EMP Commission's own report, the likelihood of a localized EMP by even non-state actors or saboteurs. I wouldn't even say that's unlikely. I'm actually surprised it hasn't happened already. So it's definitely something, and it's something that people should be aware of, and hopefully they now are, and motivated to try to drive movement on that. What was the name and location of the podcast again for Grid Down?
Yeah, you can access it through the Foundation for Infrastructure Resilience website, fir.foundation.org. And I think there's another URL I'll send to you, for the podcast.
And then your consulting company. You want to put in a plug for that?
Hartwell Capital Consulting .com. Look me up. We have some of the smartest and brightest people in the United States working on 9 different divisions on protecting our healthcare, protecting our infrastructure, protecting our military, national security. I wake up every morning with a different project, but all of them have one thing in common, that every single client I have, that every single effort that I'm making is for better healthcare, better security, cleaner energy, more efficient energy, and to protect the United States of America. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, if this episode hasn't convinced people that you're a professional that knows what you're talking about and would certainly be a great ally to have in any fight, then there's no hope for people if they don't walk away from this with that impression.
Thanks, Marcus. I appreciate it. Jim, thank you for your time. I really appreciate the interview and some of the best questions I've ever had. Thank you.
Well, as everybody should have. Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So to wrap this up, this 3-part series, Lights Out, EMP is not a mystery. We've studied it. We've admired the problems for a long, long time. It's not a mystery. It's a choice now. It's a choice between prevention or having to be reactionary. It's a choice between resilience and regret. As Rob said, be hard to look our kids in the face. Knowing what we know, if this sort of thing happens, it'd be hard to face our own children. The clock's been ticking for more than 20 years now, probably closer to 50. So Rob, thank you for spending the morning with us. We truly appreciate your time, your insight, and the work you've been doing on this issue. And as we close out this series, what we've seen is a complete picture, I think, as complete as we can paint it. The reality of the threat, the fragility of the system, and now the very sobering challenge of translating awareness into action. It's not a distant or a hypothetical problem. It's a present vulnerability and one that demands serious attention at every level. So our hope is that this series has helped bring some clarity to that issue. It's an issue that lives in the background, but we hope it prompts the kind of informed, thoughtful engagement that leads to action and real resilience at the individual, local, state, and national level. So thank you again, Rob. Appreciate you joining us for Fire Effect today. And for everyone listening, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you all next week. Thank you, gentlemen.
God bless. Me too.